So I am going to be speaking specifically to Oregon in my comments. Um, I am here this morning with our Deputy Director, Carmen Ciamara Urbina. I'm going to offer a bit of a review of some of our education initiatives that we believe are rooted in equity, in racial equity, and in anti-racism, and try to tie them a bit to this work of building a multi-tiered system um, on a foundation of equity. I think that those go well together. Carmen Ciamara may jump in and add comments along the way, and I want her to feel free to jump in and interrupt at any point if she wants to add more to anything. These first couple of slides, I think, probably really good now that that I put these in here, since we have an audience that isn't just Oregonians, and it will kind of introduce you to us a little bit. In Oregon, we serve just under 600,000 students. They come to our schools speaking more than 200 different languages. We have become pretty diverse pretty quickly over the last couple of decades. We now have about 40% of our students are students of color. Over half of them are considered economically disadvantaged. We have about 12% of our students identify as LGBTQ2SIA+. We have a pretty mobile student population, and we have about 14% of our students that identify as students who experience disabilities. When you compare that to those of us that serve our students, we are not nearly as diverse as the students that we serve. So I actually want to walk through this next slide a little bit, just to think about that. And then I'm going to speak really to our Oregon educator audience for just a minute on this slide. Like I said, nearly 40% of our students are people of color. At the Oregon Department of Education, we've worked hard, and I'll talk about this in a minute, to diversify our staff, but still only about 16% of our staff are people of color. About 11% of our administrators, 20% of our educational assistants in Oregon are people of color, and just over 10% of our teachers identify as people of color here in Oregon. This means that Oregon's children of color are being taught and in many ways being helped to be brought up by white people. And my challenge is, as you go through these next few days in this conference, is to think deeply about that responsibility and what that means. And so since I identify as a white male, and at least 90% of our educators here in Oregon identify as white people, I just want to talk about that for a couple of minutes here. All of our Black children, Indigenous children, tribal citizens, and children of color here in Oregon are spending the majority of their time being educated by us as white people. This is how it is for kids in Oregon. And as white educators, I don't think that we always deeply think about this. We don't share the same cultural view of the world. We don't come at the world with the same lens. We cannot know what it is like to grow up as a target of hate in the same way that our students of color have. We have not, as a race, experienced generational oppression, discrimination, and violence in this country like our students of color have. This oppression and violence hits them every single day in our communities and inside of our schools and online when they're participating online with our schools. As white educators, we have not always dug in to better understand and accept white privilege that has benefited us, or grappled with overcoming our own white fragility. I think that this is more true if we have not fully embraced the data that is clear around this, and concluded that it's just simply not acceptable. An example of that is that we regularly kick 3, 4, and 5-year-olds out of our education settings. This doesn't happen to our white babies, it happens to our Black and brown babies. It's more true if we haven't figured out that bilingualism is an asset, even if your first language is not English. We have to ask ourselves what we need to do to step up to the responsibility of serving our Black and African American students, our tribal citizen and Native students, our students of color, our students who experience disability, our LGBTQ2SIA plus identifying students, our emerging bilingual students, and other students who frankly just don't match the white dominant culture in this state in Oregon. Right now, the system says become more like us in the white dominant culture, in the white supremacist culture, or fail and leave. That can no longer be our answer, and that's the responsibility we are trying to step up to in Oregon. It's one where we're trying to make commitments to right past wrongs and changing systems and learning and hearing and healing together. We have to start with that space and work to make it better. We have to be both bold and strategic in this work and look for opportunity to change systems. And so my request of you is to think deeply about this through this conference. Think about creating a legacy of lasting reform. Individuals can start this change and work with teams, like David pointed out, but systems are required to maintain this new approach. ORTIi is about systems. It's all about systems, and rethinking these systems will ensure that they're actually built on a foundation of equity, like this conference is trying to put forward. And it's critical that we create systems like that to succeed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're tackling some of this here in Oregon. In Oregon, over the last 3 years, we've gone through an evolution at the Department of Education from the use of an equity lens that was adopted a few years ago to taking an equity stance and just being really clear about what we stand for and how we approach our work. And now shifting that even to what we call a distributed equity strategic plan. This is us taking a traditional strategic plan that all state agencies are required to have, throwing that out the window and saying that no longer serves us. In fact, that serves to perpetuate the white dominant culture and pushes against the kind of change that we were trying to create. So we tossed that out. We created this distributed equity strategic plan, distributed meaning each of our staff members owns a piece of this and has responsibility under it. So it is an equity, racial equity, and anti-racist approach. It requires us to use equity decision tools and create equity impact analysis for our State Board of Education whenever we bring policy decisions before them. It carries this vision that the Oregon Department of Ed will set a foundation for agency-wide culture change, recognizing that what we're doing today is different than what we need to do in the future. That will build awareness, skill, and capacity throughout the agency to more consistently and effectively interrupt historical and current patterns of neglect and oppression in order to create and ensure educational equity in Oregon's school systems. This has led to some internal work at the agency. First and foremost, we've tried to broaden our leadership cabinet team, so the leadership, and flatten the hierarchy. So we have made our team broader in terms of the number of people of color, gender, equity, and representation that much more matches our student body in Oregon. We require of every single staff member, whether they are a staff member that helps sort our mail or distributes funds to schools or works in curriculum and instruction, that they go through some significant equity training that includes Oregon's racist history and policy, includes information on discourse 2 conversations, racial battle fatigue, white privilege, white fragility, institutional racism, and racial microaggressions. The distributed equity plan and use of a decision tool I already talked about. You'll all have access to these slides, so there's links in here if you want to take a look at what any of these things are. We are working with community to align the language that we use and evolve it over time so that it is asset-based. And we've included a hiring principle that names diversity as a critical asset that is needed to meet our goals. We also recognize that because of who we are and what we stand for as a bureaucracy, we can't make these changes alone. So we are inviting our partners in newer and deeper ways. So we are home to over 60 different advisory groups, committees, commissions, boards that we have served in the past, and now we're asking them to help serve us and help us think about the needs of the students that we serve. So this has just a sampling of some of these, but you'll note that here we include our Emerging Bilinguals Visioning Committee, our English Learners Advisory Group, our American Indian Alaska Native Advisory Committee, our government to government relations with the 9 federally recognized tribes here in Oregon, the African American Black Student Success Advisory Group, our newest Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group, and our LGBTQ2SIA plus advisory group. The reason that it's important to work with these partners is because they have a better understanding often of what our communities and students need than we might. And we are home to over, right now, this is an old slide, over 100 different state and federal programs. So we send out funds to schools for a variety of purposes. We have the ability to put an equity lens and our stance around those funds and those efforts so that schools are encouraged to do good work with those. We are trying to move equity forward with a number of programs. I'm going to speed up a little bit through these. And again, each of these slides has a link and you can find out more information about any of these projects. We're taking a number of projects underway related to curriculum and standards. So we are we're one of the first states in the country to introduce ethnic studies standards. We have a single curriculum in Oregon that is required for every school district. That's our Tribal History Shared History. It was created in partnership with the 9 federally recognized tribes here in Oregon. We have learning goals around the Holocaust and genocide. We have passed a law in 2019 brought forward by the Department of Education that we call inclusive education, that ensures instructional materials that are used in our schools are actually representative of the students who call Oregon their home. When we think about students, we have a new act in Oregon, the Student Success Act. We were able to work with the legislature to center that act around focal student groups that include students of color first and foremost. Excuse me. And then there's a few other programs here. Again, I won't go deeply into, but the link will take you to them if you have an interest. I do want to touch on a couple of these civil rights efforts that are new for us. We have been working on equity and civil rights in school-sponsored activities so our students can safely participate in after-school sports and activities. We also have work underway around what we call All Students Belong to reduce racial incidents and bias in schools. I think one of the headlines of that work is that this also prohibits the display of hate symbols like the swastika, like the Confederate flag on school property. And Oregon's the first state to prohibit the display of those at school. And then a number of other projects here, again, many with links, and we're happy to help answer questions later. In the legislative process, we're moving more efforts forward, so we're not slowing down. We're trying to look forward. We're naming that our students need access to linguistic inclusion. So when we say that a student has mastered language arts, mastering language arts can happen in any language. It isn't only in English. We are putting forward to fund our LGBTQ2SIA plus student plan that was created by the LGBTQ community and students here in Oregon to better serve their needs. There's a couple of slides here again, and we're happy to answer questions around any of these efforts to improve equity. I'm going to end just with one short story and then invite Carmen if she wants to share any other information, and then we'll pass it back to you, David. This slide talks about the pushback that you get when you do this work. So just last week, we introduced to Oregon educators an opportunity to go to a workshop called Pathway to Math Equity. This was put together with several partners in California. It was featured on a conservative news broadcast, and we have been, I'm going to say, pushed down by white dominant culture and white supremacy in the United States of America, telling us that we are wrong to call math racist. We didn't call math racist. What we did was we said we have math inequities. We can tell by the color of a student's skin whether they will be successful in math in this state. And that needs to end. And that means our approach to teaching mathematics needs to end. That we need to make sure that we're able to hold every single student to the same high expectations, provide the same high quality content, ensure that we're engaging with them in a culturally responsive manner so that they can have access to that curriculum through strong relationships with the educators that work with them. So this is a shift in a perspective in the way we teach mathematics. It is not teaching, it is not saying that math itself is racist, but the systems around it can be. And so we're paying attention to that. And we're also noticing how dominant culture in this country tries to prevent you from creating change that helps all students succeed. And I'm just going to say, as you take on this work in your districts and in your schools, this will become a challenge for you as well. So you need to be able to be ready to name what you're doing for students and how you're going about it, and how you think it will make a difference for each of the students you serve. With that, I'll pause. And Carmen, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I think the only thing that I would add, Colt, is that, we are at the Oregon Department of Education. Again, we're holding, policies and practices that, our communities have to implement. And in that, we're also at the same time trying to create all the conditions possible for success. And equity, as we define it, I apologize for that, is kind of a lens and a mirror. And that lens is, who are the children in the communities that we're not serving? Applying a racial equity lens and an anti-racist lens, which allows us to be able to interrupt the current systems that have been designed intentionally to perpetuate who succeeds and who does not succeed in our systems. And therefore, we're thinking differently, we're engaging differently, and we're acting differently. And if equity would define as the lens that allows us to see who are the children and communities that we're not serving, we see that as a beautiful and amazing gift. It's not about shame, blame, or judgment, but it's also about self-reflection and putting a mirror on ourselves, right? It's not about those kids. It's not about our kids dropping out. If our kids are being pushed out, it changes the conversation completely. And it puts the ability that we have to respond to the system, not our children, our communities. And I feel that that is part of the work that, how we are engaging around those communities, those kids. Who are those communities? Who are those kids? They are our kids, they are our communities. And then, equity stands, what is the equity, lens that we're using again, but also first applying it as a mirror. I think that that's all I would have to add.
Thank you, Carmen. And thank you, David, for the opportunity to check in this morning.